Well, the United States is a very divided and rather unhappy country. The vast
Mm,
majority of Americans feel that America's on the wrong track. Confidence in institutions in the United States is low, and this cuts across almost all of the institutions in the United States. The lowest rated institution is the U.S. Congress. But the presidency gets low scores, the Supreme Court gets low scores, the media gets low scores. So, all in all, we enter 2025 in an unstable and divided state of the country. Of course, with a new president and new Congress coming in, there's hope that something can change, but there's a lot of division. There are also a lot of underlying problems. The United States is engaged in war, of course, in the Middle East and in Ukraine. It has an overextended military that's very expensive, well over $1 trillion a year, and military bases in around 80 countries around the world. It's a little bit crazy, and no other country in the world is anything like this. The U.S. budget deficit is around 7% of GDP. Interest rates are high and rising, which means for potential home buyers, for people with debts, this is quite a difficult period. And so, all in all, there are lots of preoccupations. A president that divides public opinion coming into office, and therefore a lot of uncertainty as well.
mm. For many outsiders watching US politics over the past maybe decade or so has been quite terrifying. And many feel like the US, with its political factions and political violence, seems to constantly be teetering on the brink of civil war. Do you agree with that? And why is it that US politics is so violent and so polarized?
I don't think we're on the verge of civil war in any literal sense. But I do think that our institutions stopped solving major problems many decades ago. I could give many examples, but the homelessness, the breakdown of our infrastructure, the fact that China has tens of thousands of kilometers of fast rail, and the United States doesn't have one single kilometer of fast rail. Last time I took the train from Washington to New York, I had to get off in the middle. It just broke down. I actually had to change trains. This is what we now expect in the United States. I travel a lot internationally. When I come back to an American airport, the elevators don't work, the escalators don't work, the walkways don't work. This is a broken down infrastructure. And yet, where has America put its attention? In overseas wars. It's mind-boggling, very self-defeating. Those overseas wars don't get us anything except increased insecurity and increased instability. Now, the political system has been unable to address these issues for decades. There's something pretty deeply structural going on. One part of the story is the corruption of American politics. America is a very corrupt political system, meaning that money changes hands and the money buys policies. But in the US, this is called a market. It's not called corruption. It's generally legal. But what it means is that when a politician runs for office, they look for wealthy backers from maybe a particular corporate sector. They depend on the campaign contributions. And no kidding, they give their vote to those who back them. This is all pretty obvious, pretty trivial in a way. But what a way to run a political system when you have to make decisions. Is it really up to the highest bidder? It should not be, but it is.
Now, Donald Trump is obviously about to come president again for the second time. During his second campaign, there were at least 2 significant assassination attempts made against him. For many around the world, this kind of violence is obviously quite terrifying. But I've seen some argue that political violence in the US isn't much of a big deal and that it's kind of a feature of the system rather than a bug. Do you agree with that?
Well, of course not. It's more than a bug, it's a disaster. We don't know about these assassination attempts because there are a lot of guns in the United States and there's a lot of random violence, but there's also systematic state violence. I'm not saying anything about the Trump assassination attempts, but past assassinations like John F. Kennedy in 1963 as the presidential assassination, his brother Robert in 1968, Martin Luther King in 1968. These very much look like inside jobs of part of the U.S. government, maybe with organized crime elements. But these were conspiracies that were never investigated, were covered up. And so this is something more than a bug. This is a disaster. And it is an American political reality. And we know that the U.S. deep state engages in assassinations in other parts of the world, kills political leaders, kills influential figures, generals, and so forth, and that has been a CIA modus operandi for decades, a very dangerous, a very much illegal, and a very dubious approach to global politics.
Yeah, and on that topic, Washington has kind of worked to carve the world up into free democracies versus authoritarian regimes based on its own criteria of what democracy is and what democracy should be. Why are they doing that, and when did that begin?
Well, these are phony narratives. This has nothing to do with democracy and autocracy and these loaded words. This has to do with American power. And American power, since the end of World War II, has aimed for global hegemony. In other words, for the United States to be essentially the unchallenged superpower. After 1945, that looked to be in the cards for a couple of years, and then the Soviet Union got the atomic bomb, and suddenly there was a bit of equalization. And we know, therefore, that what happened from 1945 to 1991 was the so-called Cold War era, a largely, though far from exclusively, bipolar world of a U.S. alliance and a Soviet alliance. China was not part of that alliance from the 1960s onward. So the idea of just a two-pole world was an academic construct, not a reality. But there were essentially two main superpowers. When one of them ended in December 1991 with the end of the Soviet Union, the U.S. policymakers immediately believed that we were in a unipolar world where the U.S. power would be unchallenged. And they concocted a fantasy world in which the U.S. would run the world. This became an ideology. It became a U.S. policy. It is the object of many books and articles and think tank reports and so forth, this unipolar world. It was a myth because no one country, a country of less than 5% of the world population, can presume to run the world, even if it's a very powerful country. But the United States soon found out it has peers, it has peer competitors, China obviously being the major peer competitor. But Russia's no pushover. Russia is a great power in this world. 11 time zones, the largest land area in the world, high technology, strong military base, thousands of nuclear weapons. India is a major power in the world, a lower level of income per person, but a nuclear superpower that has the world's largest population and many strengths. So the idea of unipolarity became an American myth, but I would say worse than that, it became an American delusion. Biden lived in a kind of delusional past. He was an old man, not very functional, not very smart ever, I think, as a politician, but as a president, quite incompetent. And he pushed this unipolarity, thinking, well, we'll topple Russia and Ukraine. We can corner China in Asia. All it's gotten us is more instability and, of course, more multipolarity, especially with the rise of the BRICS.
Now, the US has kind of for decades touted itself as the pinnacle of human civilization owing to its system of freedom and democracy. Some have even described the US-style liberal democracy and capitalism as the ultimate end point of human history, as the final form, if you will, of human government. Do you think that's an accurate description? And is the US system today worthy of being copied?
Again, these big words, liberal, democracy, capitalism, and so forth, when you're working intensively on real problems, whether it's environment, climate, poverty, institutional design, infrastructure, the words tend to be meaningless, basically, blurry, not at all helpful, distractions, maybe things you learn in your introductory page in a basic course, but not something you want to or could ever carry with you in real problem solving. The U.S. Is a complex mixed system of governments at multiple levels, multiple kinds of institutions, some market, some non-market. So is China, so is Russia. These basic terms are not meaningful. Also, the idea that the U.S. is some liberal democracy, we don't even know what liberal is supposed to mean in this case. But in foreign policy, the U.S. is by far the most militarized and violent country in the world. So the U.S. is engaged in nonstop wars. The U.S. is the only country in the world with even remotely the number, which is about 750 overseas military bases. The U.S. is the only country whose basic foreign policy is if you don't like the other side, try to overthrow it, either by war or by a covert regime change operation. So, no, this is not a model. This is a very powerful state that has been on an incorrect and I think largely self-destructive and delusional foreign policy for many decades. Because I asked the question, what do we as Americans get out of this foreign policy? Are we more secure? No, we're less secure because we're closer to nuclear war. This is the only potential source of risk militarily to the United States, and yet we keep provoking the very thing which is the biggest danger to us. Do we get economic benefit out of this? No. The U.S. public debt is more than 100% of GDP. We've spent trillions of dollars on wasted war. Do we win friends out of this? Of course not. We're more diplomatically isolated than at any time in modern history. America did almost the miraculous, weird thing. We took the so-called unipolar moment and made our lives less prosperous, less secure, less happy than in the Cold War era. It's unbelievable. It's just a stunning example of what hubris brings, which means you become so arrogant, so delusional, you become self-destructive, not only destructive of others.
Yeah. According to the Democracy Perception Index of 2024, Chinese people are in the top 3, I think, when it comes to feeling that their country is democratic at a whopping 79%. Now, that, I think, will come as a major surprise to many Westerners, especially since they're not aware of any other styles or any other ways of doing things. Why is it, do you think, that the US can't seem to tolerate other systems or other ways of doing things?
Well, there's a certain evangelical mode of the U.S. Political tradition, partly a religious evangelical Protestantism at the root of much of American culture. But I mean something more secular than that, which is the sense that, America has called itself the last best hope for humanity. America had the sense in early days, we are an idea more than a country. Now, it's interesting. The U.S. made many contributions to governance, creating a written constitution in a serious way of self-government was a major contribution in 1787. And it was widely emulated all over the world. The idea of written constitutions became a norm. And the United States founding fathers should get a lot of credit for that. Yet, if you were writing the U.S. Constitution today, you would not write it, I think, at least in my view, like that of 1787, as ingenious as that document was 2.5 centuries ago. So the U.S. has had this idea for a long time, but the U.S. Has always been a very mixed story, something inspiring, something successful, something creative, and something disastrous at the same time. It's notable. The U.S. was, I think it's right to say, maybe a historian would quibble with me, but I think the U.S. was the only country that had to have a massive civil war to end slavery. Slavery was a moral abomination which had been with humanity for millennia. But in the 19th century, for many, many reasons, economic and technological and moral ideas, slavery was phased out. But in most places, it was by legislation, it was by emancipation, and so forth. But in the United States, it was by a civil war because slavery was so deeply entrenched. And after the Civil War, the United States had another 100 years of apartheid rule against its own African American population. The United States committed massive genocides of native indigenous populations all through the 19th century. So these are the things that are considered impolite to discuss in American society, or one is called, unpatriotic and so forth. This nonsense. Understanding one's country's history is absolutely essential to making the society a better place. And America has that complex record. Internationally, it's got an absolutely mixed record as well. America's contribution to founding the United Nations is splendid. America's contribution to creating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is exemplary. But America's record of wars and regime change operations and coups and assassinations, color revolutions, it's awful. And so this is a mixed record. And what behooves us in America to do is to examine our own situation and to try to do better. That's the most important thing. Why are we pointing fingers at others when we should be reforming ourselves? This is, I think, a bit of moral wisdom. In Christianity, in the Gospels, Jesus Christ is quoted as saying, why do you point to the mote in the other's eye when you have a beam of wood in your own eye? And his message as a moral teacher is, don't point at the other's flaws, fix your own, for heaven's sake. That would actually inspire others to do better as well. I think it's a very good piece of advice for living, but it's also a very good piece of advice for geopolitics as well.
Now, you mentioned some positives there, and I'm interested to know what you think are some more positives about American culture that you think stand out. What are some aspects of America that maybe you look at and say, wow, that's something that makes me really proud to be an American?
Well, I live in New York City, and New York City, if you walk down the street, you hear English once in a while, but you hear it's estimated more than 200 languages. I love that. This is, as a city, a demonstration in a microcosm that the world could really live together. And I can walk out my door and I can go to a Chinese restaurant, an Indian restaurant, an Italian restaurant, a Japanese restaurant, all within a few paces of my door. That's nice. That is our world in microcosm. That's very impressive. That's the positive side. This diversity is a great strength. It's also under massive political attack. Somebody wants purity of what? America's always been, in that sense, many different ethnicities, races, creeds, national origins, and that is a great strength. Another great strength, obviously, is America found a successful way to be a very high innovation society. America needs to get and deserves enormous credit for inventing the internet, after all. And of course, it was invented as so many things as a military project, but it became a cornerstone of our civilian lives and a beneficial one. And much of the current AI revolution, much of technologies in many areas have, in the last 100 years, a U.S. resonance or provenance. In other words, that the U.S. was a main, if not the main mover. Well, that's impressive. Of course, with technology, there's always a downside as well as an upside. So it's how you use these technologies that counts. But I think America's innovation system is an impressive contribution for the whole world. It should be, and shows an institutional design of openness, creativity, the fact that you can move tens of billions of dollars into an idea, not into an actual physical production, but into an idea that will come to fruition in 5 or 10 years. That's good for the world. So there are many positives. It's the militarism, it's the violence, it's the imposition of one system. It's the lack of respect of others. And really, truly, as everybody knows, but I think it's worth emphasizing, the lack of basic knowledge of the rest of the world that I find the areas where we have a lot of work to do in this country.
So obviously, as with any place, there's a lot of good in the United States. So in your personal opinion, what would it take for the US to kind of change its path and work for the good of humanity?
It would change, it would require a change of mindset. One basic idea. The United States would have to abandon the idea that what counts is to be number one. That's a completely wrong idea. The idea of hegemony, the idea of dominance, the idea of primacy, the idea of being the sole superpower. These are the absolute mistakes of the United States. The US will be safer if the whole world feels safe and secure. The US cannot be safe and secure if the US is threatening others, or if other places are trapped in insecurity and in poverty. That doesn't make America safer. And so the basic idea of the United States that the only way to national well-being is dominance of others, this is the fundamental error of American foreign policy and American thinking, and the closely related idea that America can only be secure by dominating others gets things exactly backwards. America can only be secure if other places are secure as well. In a world of nuclear arms, in a world of rapid spread of technology, you cannot be secure at the expense of the security of others.
So do you have hope?
Of course, I have hope. Every day I have hope. Do I have high probability predictions that all will be well? Of course not. There's a lot of continuity in policy. These are deeply entrenched directions of American foreign policy. You can trace some of the bad side of American foreign policy. It's militarism, its sense of dominance, its hubris back to the 18th century, the 19th century, the 20th century, deeply entrained ideas. Yet I'm hoping that experience and study and dialogue with others can change the direction, because I've been saying for many years, American foreign policy doesn't work. We need a new foreign policy. And I think there is a growing understanding in the United States that what we have been doing isn't working. It doesn't mean a consensus to do the right thing, but it does mean a moment where there could be reflection and a change of direction.
Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Columbia University, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
Great to be with you. I really appreciate it.